Some acts of cruelty don't announce themselves with violence. They arrive quietly, wrapped in the language of justice, carried out by men who believe they're doing right. The woman sat in the center of the square with a burlap sack pulled tight over her head, thick rope binding her wrists behind her back. The crowd watched from the wooden walkway, arms crossed, faces hard. They called her the Beast, said she'd been stealing cattle for months, living wild in the hills like an animal. But no one had actually seen her face in years. The sack had been Garrett Stone's idea, said it was for everyone's protection, that looking at her might bring bad fortune. The truth was simpler and uglier. They wanted to strip away the last piece of her humanity. When Dalton Reed rode into town that morning, he had no intention of getting involved in anyone's trouble. He'd come looking for work, nothing more. But when he saw her sitting there in the dust, ropes cutting into her arms, sack rising and falling with each labored breath, something broke open inside him. The square smelled of horses and dry earth. Dalton dismounted slowly, boots hitting the ground with a soft thud that seemed too loud in the heavy silence. Kiona didn't move. She couldn't see him approach, couldn't see anything through the rough weave of burlap that scraped against her face with every breath. She'd stopped struggling an hour ago, stopped making any sound at all. The men who dragged her here had enjoyed that silence. They took it as proof of guilt, evidence of the animal nature they'd always suspected. Garrett Stone stood near the saloon entrance, thumbs hooked in his belt, watching his handiwork with satisfaction. He was a thick man with graying hair and hands that had built half the structures in this settlement. People listened when Garrett spoke, trusted him. That trust had made him bold. Dalton moved through the crowd like water, finding a crack in stone. Nobody stopped him, nobody spoke. They were too busy watching the spectacle, waiting to see what would happen next. Some had brought their children. When he reached Kiona, Dalton knelt in the dirt beside her. Up close, he could see how tightly they'd secured the sack, drawn so tight around her neck that red marks showed on her skin where the fabric met flesh. The ropes around her wrists had been tied by someone who knew their work. Professional meant to hold. He reached for the edge of the sack. Her whole body went rigid. Through the burlap, he heard the sharp intake of breath, the kind that comes before a scream or a fight. But she did neither, just sat there, trembling slightly, waiting to see what new torment this stranger had planned. Dalton's fingers found the knot at the base of her skull. It was tight, tied with the kind of precision that spoke of deliberate cruelty. As he worked at it, he felt the weight of every eye in that square pressing against his back, felt the shift in the air. The way silence can turn from passive to dangerous. Garrett's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and certain. That woman is a thief and a danger. You got no business interfering. Dalton didn't look up, didn't stop working at the knot. His voice when it came was low, steady, the kind of quiet that makes people lean in to hear. I got business with cruelty wherever I find it. The knot came loose. The sack stayed in place for a moment, held by sweat and pressure, before Dalton pulled it away. What he saw underneath stopped his breath. Not a beast, not a monster, just a woman with dark eyes wide with fear and confusion, black hair plastered to her forehead, and a face that had seen too much pain to trust kindness when it appeared. Kiona looked at him, really looked, saw a stranger with worn clothes and careful hands, saw someone who chosen to kneel in the dirt beside her, when the rest of the world had been content to watch her suffer. Something passed between them in that moment. Recognition, maybe, or just the shared understanding of what it means to be alone in a place that wants you gone. Garrett moved first. His boots struck the wooden walkway in quick succession as he descended into the square. 3 of his men following close behind. The circle that had been loose and observational suddenly became tight and threatening. Dalton rose to his feet, positioning himself between Kiona and the approaching men. His hand didn't move toward the old revolver on his hip, not yet, but the possibility hung in the air like smoke. "Step aside," Garrett said. "This ain't your concern." Dalton's jaw tightened behind him. He could hear Kiona's breathing fast and shallow. Could feel her trying to stand despite the rope still binding her wrists. He'd removed the sack from her head. That was all. But somehow it felt like he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Made a choice that would define everything that came after. The question was simple: walk away or see this through. And Dalton Reid had spent too many years running from moments like this one. His sister's face flashed in his memory. Another time he'd stood by, while others decided someone's fate. He wouldn't make that mistake again. But what Dalton didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the real thief was standing in that crowd right now, watching with satisfaction, as his crime was blamed on the woman who'd had the misfortune of being different, and when the truth finally came out, it would cost more than anyone in that square was prepared to pay. Garrett stopped 3FD from Dalton, close enough to make his point, far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. The men behind him fanned out slightly, hands resting on their belts near where holsters hung. Nobody drew, not yet, but the promise of violence saturated the air like humidity before a storm. "You don't know what you're doing," Garrett said. His voice carried the weight of authority earned through years of building the settlement from empty land. "That woman has been stealing from us for months. 15 head of cattle gone from my ranch alone. Jenkins lost 8. The Marrero lost 6 plus 2 horses." Dalton kept his eyes on Garrett, but his awareness extended to every man in that circle. He'd learned long ago to track multiple threats at once. You see her take them, don't need to see it. She's the only one living up in those hills. Cattle don't just wander off on their own. Garrett gestured toward Kiona without looking at her. She's Apache. They're raiders by nature. Everyone knows it. Behind Dalton, Kiona finally found her voice. It came out rough, like something long unused. "I took nothing from you." Garrett's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Of course you'd say that. You people always lie when you're caught." Dalton felt Kiona tense behind him, felt the surge of anger that wanted to become words, become action, but she held it, channeled it into silence. That control told him something important about her. Told him she'd survived worse than this. "Untie her hands," Dalton said quietly. "Not a chance." Garrett crossed his arms. "She's going to answer for what she's done. We're civilized people here. We follow the law." "What law?" Dalton's voice stayed level, but something cold moved through the words. "The law that says you can put a sack over someone's head and parade them through town without trial. That law." Murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Not agreement exactly, but uncertainty. The kind that appears when people realize they might have been complicit in something uglier than they'd admitted to themselves. Garrett's jaw tightened. "We caught her near the north pasture 2 days ago, right where the cattle went missing. She had blood on her clothes, from butchering." Kiona said, "A deer I hunted, not your cattle." Convenient story. Garrett turned to address the crowd, playing to them now. "She lives like an animal up there. No farm, no honest work. How else does she survive if not by taking what belongs to others?" Dalton watched the crowd's faces, saw how easily they accepted Garrett's logic, saw how fear and prejudice could dress themselves up as reason, but he also saw something else. In the back, a younger man shifted his weight nervously. His eyes wouldn't settle anywhere, kept darting between Garrett and the ground. His hands fidgeted with his belt. "Who found the cattle missing first?" Dalton asked. "I did," Garrett said. 3 weeks back. Checked the herd and came up short." "And when exactly did you see Kiona near the pasture?" 2 days ago, like I said. We'd been watching for whoever was taking them." Dalton's eyes narrowed slightly. Something in the timing didn't sit right. But before he could press further, Jenkins stepped forward from the crowd. He was a wiry man with sun-damaged skin and eyes that had seen too many hard seasons. "Look, stranger, we appreciate you having a conscience and all, but you don't live here. You don't know how things have been." Jenkins glanced at Kiona with something that might have been pity or might have been disgust, hard to tell which. "She's been trouble since she showed up 3 years ago. Keeps to herself, won't talk to anyone, won't come to town. That's not natural. Being alone isn't a crime," Dalton said. "No." Garrett's voice dropped lower. "More dangerous, but stealing is. You're defending a thief. That makes you complicit. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to step aside, get on your horse, and ride out. Forget you saw any of this, or you're going to find yourself in more trouble than you can handle." Dalton didn't move. The sun beat down on his shoulders. Sweat traced a line down his spine. Every instinct he'd honed over years of surviving told him to do exactly what Garrett suggested, walk away. This wasn't his town, wasn't his problem, but those instincts had failed him before. When his sister needed someone to stand up for her, those same instincts had told him not to interfere in family business that wasn't his to judge. He'd listened to them then. She'd died because of it. "No," Dalton said simply. Garrett's face went hard. He nodded to the men behind him. They moved forward as one, hands now hovering over their weapons. The crowd pulled back, giving them room, giving them permission. But before anyone could draw, a shout came from the far end of the square. Everyone turned. A rider was coming in fast. Horse L, there and breathing hard. He pulled up in a spray of dust and dismounted in one motion. Garrett, the rider, was breathing almost as hard as his horse, the North Pasture. "You need to see this right now. What is it?" The rider's eyes cut to Kona, then back to Garrett. "The cattle, we found them." The silence that followed those words stretched thin as wire. Garrett's face went through several expressions at once. Confusion, relief, then something darker that vanished too quickly to name. "Where?" he demanded. "Box Canyon, 2 miles past the ridge. All of them penned in with brush and rope." The rider wiped sweat from his forehead. "They're thirsty and hungry but alive." The crowd erupted in conversation, people talking over each other, asking questions, expressing relief. In the chaos, Dalton watched Garrett carefully, watched how the man's eyes went to that nervous younger man in back, held there for just a moment, then cut away. Watched how his jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't spit out. "Well," Dalton said into the noise, "seems like the cattle weren't stolen after all, just moved. Or she moved them there to hide them," Garrett countered quickly. "Too quickly. Planned to come back and sell them when things cooled down." Kiona made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "I live alone in the hills. Who would I sell them to? And we—" "What, you think I have a wagon? A team to pull one?" Her logic was sound. Dalton could see others in the crowd starting to recognize it, too. The certainty that had held them together was beginning to crack. Jenkins looked uncomfortable now. The woman who brought her children pulled them closer as if ashamed they'd seen this. "Untie her," Dalton said again. This time it wasn't a request. Garrett opened his mouth to argue, but the moment had shifted. The righteous anger that had fueled this public spectacle was leaking away, replaced by something more dangerous. Doubt. Doubt made people defensive, made them look for someone to blame. "Fine." Garrett gestured sharply to one of his men. "Cut her loose. But this doesn't mean she's innocent. It just means we need to look harder at what she's been doing up there." The man moved behind Kiona and sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. She brought her hands forward slowly, wincing as circulation returned in painful pins. Needles, her wrists were raw where the rope had cut into skin. Dalton saw her glance at him. Something complicated moving behind those dark eyes. Not gratitude exactly, more like assessment, trying to understand why he'd done what he'd done. The crowd began to disperse, people drifting back to their interrupted day, already rewriting what they'd witnessed into something more comfortable, something that didn't require them to examine their own cruelty. But Garrett didn't move. He stood watching Kiona with an expression that promised this wasn't over. "You should leave," he said, not Dalton to her, "leave these hills. Go back to wherever your people ended up. There's nothing for you here but trouble." Kiona met his eyes steadily. "My people are dead. This is my home now. I have as much right to be here as you rights." Garrett's voice dripped contempt. "You people lost your rights when you lost the land. You're here because we allow it. Remember that." He turned and walked away, his men following, but that nervous young man lingered, eyes still on Kiona with something that looked like guilt or maybe fear. Then he too turned and disappeared into the dispersing crowd. Dalton waited until they were mostly alone before he spoke. "You have somewhere safe to go. I've been safe for 3 years without your help." Kiona rubbed her wrists gingerly. "Why did you do that? Interfere?" Seemed like the right thing, the right thing. She studied him with an intensity that made him want to look away. "People don't do the right thing. They do what benefits them. What do you want from me?" "Nothing. Everyone wants something." She took a step back, creating distance. "Thank you for removing the sack, but I don't need rescue. I don't need protection, and I definitely don't need pity." She turned to leave. Dalton almost let her go. Almost. But something made him reach out, fingers closing gently around her forearm. She went rigid at the touch, every muscle tensing like a trapped animal about to fight. "Those cattle didn't pen themselves," Dalton said quietly. "Someone put them there. Someone who wanted you blamed. And whoever it was, they're still out there." Kiona pulled her arm free, but didn't walk away. "Why do you care?" Before Dalton could answer, a rock sailed through the air and struck Kiona's shoulder. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to hurt. They both turned. 3 boys stood at the edge of the square, maybe 12 or 13 years old. The kind of age where cruelty comes easy and consequences seem distant. "Beast," one of them shouted, "go back to your cave." Another rock flew. This one Kiona caught midair with reflexes that spoke of years defending herself. She threw it back, not at the boys, but at their feet. They scattered, laughing. The sound of it, that casual, thoughtless laughter, was somehow worse than the rocks. Kiona's face had gone carefully blank. "This is why I live alone," she said. "This is why I stay in the hills, because even when they know I'm innocent, even when the truth is right in front of them, they'll still see a beast." She walked away, then heading toward the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open land. Dalton watched her go, watched the way she held herself, spine straight, head up, refusing to show them any weakness. But he'd seen her eyes before she turned away. Seen the hurt there that no amount of pride could quite hide. And he'd seen something else, too. That nervous young man was following her, keeping his distance, but definitely following. His hand rested on the knife at his belt. Whatever business he had with Kiona, it wasn't finished. Dalton didn't think. He just moved. Years of instinct took over as he followed the young man who was following Kiona. The stranger stayed well back, using buildings and wagons for cover, clearly inexperienced at tracking, but determined enough to try. Kiona had already left the main settlement behind, heading toward the rocky hills that rose like broken teeth against the horizon. She walked with purpose, not looking back, as if she'd long ago accepted that people would watch her leave with relief. The young man Dalton had heard someone call him Curtis earlier picked up his pace. His hand stayed on that knife. Whatever he planned to do, he wanted to do it away from witnesses. Dalton closed the distance between them carefully. The land here was open scrub and scattered stones, offering little concealment, but Curtis was focused entirely on Kiona, tunnel vision that comes from fear or guilt or both. They were maybe a /4 mile from town. When Curtis made his move, he broke into a jog, closing the gap quickly. "Hey," he called out, "you need to stop." Kiona turned and Dalton saw her body shift immediately into a defensive stance, not aggressive but ready. She'd clearly had to defend herself before. "Leave me alone," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the distance. "I can't." Curtis stopped about 10 feet from her, breathing hard, not from exertion, from nerves. "You need to leave tonight. Don't come back." "Why?" Kona's eyes narrowed. "Why do you care where I go?" Curtis glanced back toward town like he was checking to see if anyone had followed. He didn't see Dalton, who dropped into a crouch behind a cluster of rocks. "Because if you don't leave, something bad is going to happen to you worse than today." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning." Curtis took a step closer. His hand tightened on the knife handle. "Please just go. Take whatever you need and run. Go north, go south. I don't care. Just get out of this territory." Kiona studied him with that same intense focus she'd turned on Dalton earlier. "You know something about the cattle." Curtis flinched like she'd struck him. "I don't know anything." "You're lying." She took a step toward him instead of away. "You were there in the canyon. You helped pen them." "No." But his voice cracked on the word. "No, I didn't. You're wrong." "Then why are you here?" "Why warn me?" Kiona moved closer still. "Why do you look like you haven't slept since those cattle were found?" Curtis pulled the knife. Not in a threatening way, more like he needed something to hold onto. His hand shook. "You don't understand. If you stay, if you keep asking questions, Garrett will." He stopped, caught himself, but he'd already said enough. Dalton rose from behind the rocks. "Garrett will what?" Curtis spun around, knife raised. When he saw Dalton, the blood drained from his face. "You? Why are you following me?" "Same reason you're following her, except I'm not carrying a knife." Dalton walked forward slowly, hands visible and empty. "What's Garrett going to do, Curtis?" "How do you know my name?" "Heard someone say it. Small town people talk." Dalton stopped a few feet away. "Now answer the question. What's Garrett planning?" Curtis looked between them, trapped. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I can't. If I say anything, my family depends on him. My father works his ranch. If I cross Garrett, we'll lose everything. And if Kiona dies because you stayed silent, Dalton, let that question hang in the air. You'll carry that the rest of your life. Trust me, that weight doesn't get lighter with time." Something in Dalton's voice must have reached Curtis, because the young man's shoulders sagged. The knife lowered slightly. "I didn't want any of this. I just needed money. Garrett offered me $50 to move the cattle. Said it was just a joke, a way to make the Apache woman look bad so she'd leave on her own. Said nobody would get hurt." "But someone is going to get hurt," Kiona said quietly. "Aren't they?" Curtis nodded miserably. "Garrett's been losing money, bad investments back east. He owes people, dangerous people. When the cattle turned up too soon before he could sell them, he got desperate. He told me this morning that if you don't leave or if anyone starts asking too many questions, he'll make sure you have an accident. Make it look like you fell from the rocks or got attacked by a wild animal." The words settled over them like ash. Dalton felt rage building in his chest, the kind that makes hands shake and vision narrow. "Why tell us this now? Because I'm not a killer." Curtis wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm just a stupid kid who made a stupid choice, but I won't be part of someone dying. I won't." "Then you need to testify," Dalton said. "Tell people what Garrett did. They won't believe me over him. He built half this town." "My word against his." Curtis laughed bitterly. "I'll end up in worse trouble than her. Maybe." Dalton glanced at Kiona, saw her watching him with something that might have been respect, but staying silent guarantees she ends up dead, and you end up living with that knowledge. So you need to decide who you want to be. Curtis, right now." The young man stood there, knife hanging loose in his hand, face twisted with conflict. Finally he nodded. "Okay, I'll talk, but we need proof. Something more than just my word." "What kind of proof?" Kiona asked. Curtis thought for a moment. "There's a ledger in Garrett's office at the ranch. Shows the real accounts, not the ones he lets people see. Shows how much he's lost, how desperate he is. If we can get that, then we have leverage." Dalton finished. "But his ranch is guarded at night, 3 men at least, and Garrett himself sleeps in the main house." Curtis shook his head. Getting in there without being seen would be nearly impossible. Kiona's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Nearly impossible is different from impossible, and I know every inch of this territory, including ways onto that ranch that Garrett's men don't watch. Dalton looked at her. You're thinking of going there tonight. I'm thinking, she said, that I'm tired of running. Tired of hiding. If Curtis is willing to help expose the truth, then I'm willing to get that ledger. It's too dangerous. Everything about my life is dangerous. Kiona met his eyes. You saved me from one kind of death today. Are you willing to help me fight another? They made their plans in Kona's camp. It wasn't much lean to built against a rock face, a small fire pit, and a few belongings that could be packed and carried in minutes. The kind of place someone builds when they expect to run at any moment. Dalton noticed how little she had. A blanket, a cooking pot, a knife, some dried meat hanging from a rope. This was how she'd lived for 3 years. Always ready to flee, never settling in enough to call it home. Curtis had gone back to town to avoid suspicion. They'd meet him after dark near the northern approach to Garrett's ranch. That gave them a few hours to prepare and a few hours for Dalton to wonder what he'd gotten himself into. You don't have to do this, Kiona said. She was sharpening her knife on a flat stone, the rhythmic sound filling the silence between them. This is my fight, not yours. Seems like it became my fight the moment I took that sack off your head. Dalton sat across the fire from her, watching the way the flames cast shadows across her face. Besides, Curtis isn't wrong. You go in alone, even with his help, and something goes wrong. You'll be the one they blame. They blame me for everything already. What difference does one more thing make? The difference between surviving and not surviving. Dalton leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You asked me why I interfered today, why I helped you. Kiona stopped sharpening. Waited? I had a sister younger. She got involved with a man who wasn't good to her. Everyone could see at the bruises she tried to hide. The way she flinched when he raised his voice, but it was family business, people said, not our place to interfere. Dalton's voice went quiet. I told myself the same thing, stayed out of it. Figured she'd leave him when she was ready, but she didn't. No, she stayed, and one night he went too far. Dalton looked into the fire instead of at Kiona. By the time I stopped pretending it wasn't my business, it was too late. So when I saw you today sitting there with that sack over your head while everyone stood by and watched, I couldn't do nothing. Not again, Kiona set the knife down carefully. I'm sorry about your sister, so am I. Dalton met her eyes across the flames. But being sorry doesn't bring her back, doesn't change what I didn't do. All I can do now is try not to make the same mistake twice. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Kiona spoke, her voice carrying a weight that came from holding words in too long. My tribe was camped near a river. The soldiers came at dawn, said we'd violated treaty terms, crossed into territory we weren't allowed in anymore. Most of us were still sleeping. She paused, swallowed. They gave us 10 minutes to gather what we could carry. Anyone who argued or moved too slow, they shot them. My husband tried to protect our daughter. They killed him first, then her. Dalton felt something crack open in his chest. How did you survive? I ran like a coward. Kiona's hands clenched into fists. I heard my daughter screaming for me, and I ran into the woods and hid like an animal. When I finally came back, everyone was dead or gone. I buried what was left. Then I came here to these empty hills where nobody wanted to be, and I've been hiding ever since. That's not cowardice. That's survival. Is there a difference? Kiona looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. Every day I'm alive, I think about them, about how I should have stayed, should have fought. You'd be dead, too. At least I'd be with them. Dalton understood that feeling. the guilt that came from surviving when others didn't. The constant question of whether living was worth the weight of carrying their memory. Your people didn't die, so you could waste your life wishing you died with them. He said they died hoping you'd live, hoping you'd carry something of them forward. What's there to carry forward? Kiona gestured at the bare camp around them. I have nothing, I am nothing, just the beast they think I am. No, Dalton stood and walked around the fire to where she sat, knelt down so they were eye level. You're a woman who survived something that would have broken most people, who kept going when it would have been easier to give up, who just agreed to risk her life to expose the truth, even though it would be safer to run. He hesitated, then reached out and gently touched her scarred wrist where the ropes had cut into her. That's not nothing. That's not a beast. That's someone worth fighting for. Kiona stared at him. Something shifted in her expression. The careful walls she'd built around herself, developing the first hairline cracks. You don't even know me. I know enough. Dalton's hand lingered on her wrist, felt her pulse beating fast beneath his fingers. I know you deserve better than what this world has given you. And I know that if we're doing this thing tonight, I'd rather do it with you than anyone else. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither could quite name. Then Kiona pulled her hand back slowly, not rejecting the touch, but protecting herself from the hope it represented. We should go, she said, before I lose my nerve. You won't. How do you know? Dalton stood and offered his hand to help her up because people who lose their nerve don't survive 3 years alone in hostile territory, and they definitely don't offer to break into a guarded ranch to steal evidence from a dangerous man. Kiona took his hand, let him pull her to her feet, stood there for a moment, close enough that he could see gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her skin. If we die tonight, she said quietly, at least I won't die alone. We're not going to die. You can't promise that. No, Dalton admitted. But I can promise I'll do everything I can to make sure we both walk away from this. Kiona nodded, released his hand, started gathering what little she'd need. Her knife, a length of rope, a dark blanket to cover her lighter clothing. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, they prepared to do something either brave or foolish, maybe both. But as Dalton watched Kiona move with quiet efficiency around the camp, he realized something. For the first time since his sister died, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Not running from guilt, not hiding from responsibility, but standing up and fighting for someone who deserved to be fought for even if it cost him everything. The moon was a thin slice of silver when they reached the northern edge of Garrett's property. Curtis waited in the shadows where he'd promised, his face pale in the darkness. 3 horses stood nearby, already saddled, smart. If things went wrong, they'd need to run fast. Guards just changed, Curtis whispered. 2 at the main gate, 1 circling the corral. There's a 4th inside the house with Garrett. That's his nephew, Marvin, doesn't leave Garrett's side. Kiona studied the layout from their position behind a rocky outcrop. The main house sat in the center of cleared land, making direct approach impossible without being seen. But she told Dalton the truth. She knew this territory, knew the small creek that ran behind property, cutting through a shallow ravine that provided cover almost to the back wall. The office is on the ground floor, Curtis said. Western corner window faces the creek, but it'll be locked. Windows can be opened. Kiona looked at Dalton. You stay here with Curtis. If we're not back in 20 minutes, ride for town, get the marshal. Not a chance. Dalton checked his revolver, making sure it moved smoothly in its holster. We go together or not at all. You'll slow me down, maybe, but if you get caught, I can create a distraction, draw them away. He met her eyes steadily. We're doing this together. Kiona wanted to argue, wanted to tell him this was her burden to carry alone, like she'd carried everything alone for 3 years. but the determined set of his jaw told her arguing would waste precious time. Fine, stay close and stay quiet. She turned to Curtis. If shooting starts, you run. Don't try to help. Just get to the marshal and tell him everything. Curtis nodded, looking relieved to have a role that didn't involve getting closer to danger. They moved through the darkness like shadows. Kiona led, her feet finding solid ground instinctively, avoiding loose stones and dry brush that would make noise. Dalton followed, trying to match her movements. He was good, better than she'd expected for someone who probably spent most of his time on horseback rather than moving through difficult terrain on foot. The creek bed was dry this time of year, leaving a channel of smooth stones and hard, packed earth. They moved along it quickly, the high banks on either side hiding them from view. Kiona's heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear exactly, from the strange sensation of having someone at her back, of not being alone. They reached the point closest to the house. Kiona raised her hand, signaling Dalton to stop. Through the gap in the bank, she could see the guard circling the corral. He carried a rifle loosely, clearly not expecting trouble. Why would he? Nobody had ever challenged Garrett Stone before. They waited until the guard passed, his footsteps crunching on gravel, then disappeared around the far side of the building. Kiona counted to 10, then moved. She scrambled up the bank, Dalton right behind her. They crossed the open ground in a sprint that felt like it lasted forever, but probably took only seconds. The office window was exactly where Curtis said it would be. Kiona pulled her knife and worked the blade carefully into the gap between the window frame and sill. Old wood swollen from moisture, the kind that warped and left gaps. After a moment, she felt the latch give way. The window opened with a soft creak that sounded deafening in the quiet night. They both froze, listening. No shouts, no running footsteps, just the distant sound of the guard's boots and the soft rustle of wind through dry grass. Dalton helped her through the window first, then climbed in after her. The office smelled of leather and tobacco. Smoke moonlight filtered through the window, providing just enough light to see the desk, the chairs, the shelves lined with books and papers. The ledger, Dalton whispered. What does it look like? Curtis said. It has a brown leather cover. Garrett keeps it locked in the desk drawer. They moved to the desk. Dalton tried the drawer, locked as expected. He pulled a thin piece of metal from his pocket, the kind used to clean rifles, and worked it into the lock. Kiona watched the door, every muscle tense, ready to fight or flee. The lock clicked. Dalton pulled the drawer open slowly, minimizing sound. Inside, among various papers and a small cash box, sat a leather-bound ledger. He lifted it out carefully and opened to a random page. Even in the dim light, the numbers told a clear story. Columns marked actual verses reported debts listed in red. Sales recorded that didn't match the public accounts. Evidence of a man drowning in financial ruin and willing to do anything to hide it. This is it, Dalton breathed. This proves everything. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. They both froze. Footsteps approached the office door, heavy, deliberate. Someone knew they were here. The door swung open. Lamplight flooded the room. Garrett stood in the doorway, his nephew Marvin beside him holding a rifle. Garrett's face showed no surprise, only cold satisfaction. I wondered how long it would take you to try something this stupid, Garrett said. He stepped into the room, Marvin following, the rifle never wavering from its aim at Dalton's chest. Curtis came running to warn me the moment you left him, told me everything. The boy might be weak, but at least he knows where his loyalty lies. Kiona felt the words like a physical blow. Curtis had betrayed them, led them straight into a trap. She glanced at Dalton, saw the same realization settling over his features. You're holding my property, Garrett said, nodding toward the ledger in Dalton's hands. That's theft, and you broke into my home. That's trespassing. His smile was cold, Marvin, I think we have every right to defend ourselves, don't you? Marvin's finger moved to the trigger, the rifle barrel steady, aimed at Dalton's heart. Wait, Kiona stepped forward, placing herself between Dalton and the gun. Let him go. This was my idea, my plan. He just followed me here. Kiona, don't. Dalton started. No. She cut him off. You've done enough. You tried to help, but this is where it ends. Let him leave. Keep me if you need someone to blame. Garrett laughed. How noble. The beast has a heart after all. He moved closer, studying her with the kind of look usually reserved for livestock at auction. You know what? You're right. This is where it ends, but not the way you think. Garrett pulled a revolver from his belt. Here's what's going to happen. You two are going to have a tragic accident out in those hills where the beast lives. A struggle. Maybe she attacked you, stranger. Maybe you fought back. Either way, when they find your bodies tomorrow, it'll be clear what happened. Self-defense justified. People saw us together in town, Dalton said. His hand inched toward his own weapon. They'll know. They'll know. An outsider tried to defend a thief and paid the price. Garrett cocked the hammer on his revolver. Marvin, if either of them moves, shoot. But Garrett had made a mistake. He'd focused on Dalton at the primary threat, positioned himself to keep the man covered. That left Kiona, the woman he'd called a beast, slightly to the side. Underestimated, she moved fast, not toward Garrett, but toward the lamp Marvin had set on the desk. Her hand connected with it, knocking it sideways. It fell, oil spilling across the wooden surface, flames catching instantly. Fire spread across the desk in a wave of heat and light. Marvin jerked backward, startled. The rifle barrel swung away from Dalton for just a moment. That was all the opening Dalton needed. He lunged forward, grabbing the rifle barrel and pushing it upward. It discharged with a deafening crack, the bullet burying itself in the ceiling. Kiona threw herself at Garrett. He was bigger, stronger, but she had desperation, 3 years of survival instinct driving her. They hit the floor together, his revolver skittering away across the wood. She drove her knee into his stomach, heard the breath leave him in a grunt. Dalton wrestled with Marvin for control of the rifle. They crashed into the bookshelf, sending papers and ledgers cascading down. The fire on the desk was spreading, eating through papers, reaching for the curtains. Stop! A voice from the doorway. Everyone froze. The marshal stood there, revolver drawn. Curtis behind him looking terrified. Everyone on the ground now. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Dalton slowly released the rifle and raised his hands. Marvin backed away, breathing hard. Kiona climbed off Garrett, who lay gasping on the floor. Marshal Hayes. Garrett found his voice, though it came out strained. Thank goodness you're here. These two broke into my home, tried to rob me. That's not what Curtis told me. The marshal's revolver stayed level, not aimed at anyone specifically, but ready to target whoever moved wrong. Said, you've been running a scheme, stealing your own cattle to collect insurance money, setting up this woman to take the blame. Curtis is a confused boy. He doesn't know what he's saying. Maybe the marshal's eyes were hard, but that ledger there tells a different story, the one that's about to catch fire. Dalton grabbed the ledger from where it had fallen, stamping out the flames that were beginning to catch at its edges. He handed it to the marshal. It's all in here. Every lie, every debt. Proof he moved his own cattle and blamed Kiona. Marshal Hayes flipped through the pages quickly, his expression darkening with each entry he scanned. Behind him, shouts echoed from outside. The guards had noticed the fire. We're coming to investigate. Curtis, the marshal said without looking away from Garrett. Go tell those men to bring water. We need to contain this fire before it spreads. Curtis disappeared. Sounds of commotion grew outside as the guards mobilized to fight the flames. You can't trust that book, Garrett said. He'd managed to sit up, one hand pressed against his ribs where Kiona had kneed him. It's personal. Private, not meant for public eyes. Then you shouldn't have kept such detailed records of your crimes. The marshal closed the ledger. Garrett Stone, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted violence. Marvin, you too, this is ridiculous. Garrett's voice rose. I'm a respected member of this community. I built half this town. You're going to believe some savage and a drifter over me. I'm going to believe evidence. The marshal gestured toward the door. Now move, both of you. Marvin went without protest, his face ashen, but Garrett wasn't finished. As he stood, his hand darted toward the revolver he'd dropped earlier. His fingers closed around the grip. Kiona saw it first, saw the rage in his eyes, the desperation of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. She moved without thinking, throwing herself sideways into Dalton, pushing him out of the line of fire just as Garrett's revolver came up. The shot rang out. Kiona felt something white-hot tear across her shoulder, spinning her around. She hit the wall and slid down, hand coming up to touch the wound. Blood, but not as much as she'd expected. The bullet had grazed her, cutting a furrow through flesh, but missing anything vital. The marshal's revolver spoke twice. Garrett dropped, the weapon falling from his hand. He clutched his leg, screaming. The marshal had aimed deliberately, not a killing shot, just disabling. That's enough. The marshal's voice cut through the chaos. One more move from anyone, and the next bullet goes center mass. Nobody moved. The fire on the desk had been mostly contained by the lack of additional fuel, burning itself out. Smoke filled the room, acrid and thick. Outside, the guards arrived with buckets of water, pushing through the door to douse what remained of the flames. Dalton was beside Kiona immediately, hands gentle as he examined her shoulder. You're hit. I'm fine. But her voice shook slightly. The reality of what had almost happened, what she'd prevented, was settling over her. You alive because of you. His hands trembled as he pressed his bandana against her wound, applying pressure. That was the second time today you've put yourself between me and danger. You did the same for me first. Their eyes met in the smoky chaos, with blood on her shoulder and the smell of burned wood in the air. Something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement that they'd saved each other in ways that went beyond just physical protection. The marshal was securing Garrett's hands with rope. Marvin, already restrained, will need statements from both of you and Curtis. This is going to be complicated. Complicated how? Dalton asked, still holding pressure on Kiona's wound. Because Garrett's right about one thing. He did build a lot of this town, has a lot of friends. Some won't want to believe what he's done. The marshal looked at Kiona. They'll want to blame you still. Old prejudices die hard. Let them blame me. Kiona's voice was steady despite the pain. I'm used to it. At least now we have proof of the truth. Proof helps, the marshal said, but truth and justice aren't always the same thing. The town gathered in the square the next morning. The same square where they'd watched Kiona sit with a sack over her head just one day ago. But this time, the marshal stood on the wooden platform with the ledger open in his hands, reading the evidence aloud for everyone to hear. Garrett Stone sat on a bench nearby, leg bandaged, hands bound. His nephew Marvin sat beside him, head down. Neither man looked at the crowd, neither tried to defend themselves anymore. The numbers spoke for themselves. Fraud, theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Kiona stood at the edge of the gathering, Dalton beside her. His hand rested lightly on her good shoulder, the one that wasn't bandaged beneath her shirt. She'd refused to let the doctor in town touch her. Didn't trust any of them yet. So Dalton had cleaned and dressed the wound himself by lamplight, his hands gentle and careful. She'd never let anyone care for her like that. Not in 3 years, maybe not ever. People kept glancing at her, some with shame, some with curiosity, a few with something that might have been the beginning of respect. Jenkins approached slowly. Hat in his hands, he stopped a few feet away looking uncomfortable. Miss, he said, then cleared his throat. I owe you an apology. We all do. What we did yesterday, what we let happen, there's no excuse for it. Kiona studied him, saw genuine remorse in his weathered face. You watched them put a sack over my head and tie me up. Brought your friends to see the show. Jenkins flinched. Yes, ma'am, we did, and I'll carry that shame until I die. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to make it right. Got a section of land that needs working. Could use someone who knows how to survive in rough country. Pays fair. Cabin comes with it. I don't need your charity. It's not charity, it's work. Honest work for honest pay. Jenkins met her eyes and maybe a chance for all of us to be better than we were yesterday. Before Kiona could respond, Curtis pushed through the crowd. His face was bruised. Garrett had beaten him badly when he tried to back out of the trap. But Curtis had gone to the marshal anyway, had told the truth despite knowing what it might cost him. I'm sorry, Curtis said, his voice cracked. I was scared. Garrett said he'd ruin my family if I didn't help. But that doesn't excuse what I almost did. You both could have died because of me. Dalton stepped forward, extended his hand. You made the right choice when it mattered. That's what counts. Curtis took the hand, shaking it firmly. Thank you, both of you. The marshal finished reading. The crowd dispersed slowly, talking among themselves. Justice had been served, but it left a bitter taste. Their town's founder revealed as a fraud, their own cruelty exposed. As the square emptied, Dalton turned to Kona. What are you going to do now? She looked at the hills in the distance, the place she'd hidden for 3 years, then at the town around them. Still hostile in some ways, but maybe changing, I don't know, she admitted. Part of me wants to run, go somewhere nobody knows my name or my face. And the other part thinks maybe it's time to stop hiding. She touched her shoulder where the bullet had grazed. You could have let me take that bullet. Could have stepped aside and saved yourself. But you stayed even knowing what it might cost. You did the same for me twice. That's different. How? Kiona struggled to find words because you saw me, not the beast they created, not the thing in the sack. You saw me when nobody else could. Dalton's hand found hers. I saw someone worth seeing, someone worth fighting for, someone with more courage and heart than anyone else in this whole territory. She looked down at their joined hands. His skin against hers connection. She'd denied herself for so long. I don't know how to do this. Trust someone. Let someone in, neither do I. Dalton smiled slightly. We could figure it out together if you want. Kiona thought about the empty hills, the lonely camp, the years of isolation that had kept her safe, but also kept her from living. Then she thought about Dalton kneeling beside her in the dust, removing the sack, seeing her humanity when the world saw only a beast. Stay, she said. Work that land Jenkins mentioned with me. I know these hills, know what grows here, what survives. She squeezed his hand. I could teach you, and you could teach me what? How to stop running from the past. How to build something new. Dalton pulled her closer. How to have hope again. They stood there in the emptying square. Two people who'd survived their own kinds of loss, who'd found each other in the worst moment, and chosen to fight instead of flee. The town would talk. Some would never accept them, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the choice they were making now. To stay, to build, to trust that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. Dalton touched the place on her shoulder where his bandana still bound her wound. They called you a beast, put you in a sack to hide your face. But when I looked inside, all I found was someone with more heart than all of them combined. Kiona leaned into him slightly, let herself feel the warmth of another person for the first time in years. Then I guess you found what you were looking for. I think we both did. They walked toward the edge of town together, toward Jenkins's land, toward a cabin that could become a home. The past would always be there, the losses, the pain, the scars, But maybe, just maybe, the future could be different. And for the first time since she'd buried her family by that river, Kiona allowed herself to believe it. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the untamed frontier, where courage and redemption collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.